Well, a very warm welcome to Elizabeth Cowans, who's going to give us now the second part of this talk that was done live at King's Priory School earlier in 2023. So we thought we'd put a recording together, so it's on the YouTube channel for those of you doing AS and A-level geography and your NEA. We've been developing over the years a lot of material about the Ousbourne area of Newcastle, and this time it's St Lawrence and St Peter's ward on the North Bank. So if you haven't watched the first part of this about the industrialisation of this area, you might want to watch part 1 first, but this is about industrialisation, impact and recovery. Over to you, Liz.
Thank you. Right, welcome back. The second part of the workshop is about what happened when events overtake the industry on our named area, with special implications for Hawthorn Leslie and the big shipbuilding companies which lined especially the northern bank of the Tyne. The impact is not purely a factory is closed down. The impact is what happens when a factory closes down, and it has been an essential prop for the people who live in that area because they rely on the income. But it can also impact the environment, it can impact investment, and there are some nice photographs. I do like photographs. There are some nice photographs from the Ousbourne which shows what it was like. We've got to remember also that post-war there was no money, and any kind of renovation or improvement would take an awful long time to finance. So I think that's the other thing that we've got to remember, that events can overtake success in a factory. In both sections, I've included some ideas of presentation, and we're going to look here about presentation of photographs, how you can show them, how you can get best marks for them. And hopefully, even if you don't live in the Northeast, the idea of techniques and sources will help you not only just to do maybe a personal inquiry, but also will help you to structure your answers when you've got to do an exam. There is a task file containing maps and suggestions with exercises which you can print off, help yourself, with a PowerPoint on deindustrialisation. If you request them, Tyne and Weir GA, Brenda, I'm sure, will be able to send them out to you on an email. But it's just the fact that there's something for you to do, which is it puts what you've learnt into context. We know that deindustrialisation and the River Tyne must have begun during the Great Depressions, impacted by the Wall Street crash, wars, revolutions, new developments in energy sources away from coal, the emergence of other countries which can make things cheaper and also which delivered on time. One of the big problems with shipbuilding was that because of problems with labour forces, sometimes delivery dates were not kept, and this was it gave a bad impression. New countries who were developing their own industries obviously could get things delivered on time, and in 1980 the coal mines started to run down. Steelworks were maybe not as efficient as they could be. So while manufacturing is decreasing, you've got an increase in tertiary and quaternary backgrounds. The domino effect, of course, was the reverse of the multiplier. When one domino goes down, it impacts everything. And if somewhere like, for example, Hawthorn Leslie shut down, or some shipbuilding industry shut down, or if a large manufacturing and electrical plant shut down, it has repercussions right the way through the entire society. And that's the domino effect. It's when everything starts to go backwards. Photographs can tell you an awful lot. These were reproduced by kind permission from the Ouseburn Trust and the Boat Club of the Ouseburn. These are the 1960s and the 1970s in the Ouseburn. It isn't St. Peter's Basin and it isn't St. Leonard's, and I know that, but they actually showed what it can look like. It's a black and white photograph which shows how miserable and depressing it must have been to show all of these buildings being allowed to decay and also to demolish them. They're old, they're rundown. You could use the word blighted, they're old-fashioned. One of them showed a cattle sanitarium, which wouldn't have been used for years. You were undergoing building and slum clearance. Who would invest? If you had investors coming from another country saying they want to invest in the Northeast, you certainly wouldn't show them this, because they would go and find somewhere else in Cheshire or, you know, south of Scotland, anywhere, but to actually build in this area. The houses are demolished, your labour force is gone, and the same kind of thing would have been happening in St. Peter's and St. Leonard's. Decaying buildings are symptomatic of deindustrialisation. What would have been industries near the mouth of the river, they're all starting to shut down. They're starting to close because there's no demand for what they're making. And there again, you've got a very nice picture of a demolishing cattle sanitarium. Obviously, animals weren't brought in, they weren't being slaughtered for meat. They weren't walking along Lime Street. But you did have, when we looked at the maps near to St. Leonard's and St. Peter's, manure works. Remember that Newcastle was a Victorian city, it worked on horses, and the manure, along with human manure, would go down and be used and converted into fertilizer for growing food. So it's a very much a circular use of materials in the area, but the cattle sanitarium is actually losing its roof, so it's not doing too well. Demolition had to be increased, and unfortunately in some areas, again, this is the Ouseburn, this was a lead works, and the actual pollution caused by the factory and the processes which took place in that factory devastated the environment. It's the same kind of thing where you had along in St. Peter's, St. Leonard's, you did have land pollution, environmental pollution, air pollution, and dereliction. And this is a consequence of deindustrialisation. Nobody wanted the products which were being made here to use in whatever industry could attract them. So it's really not going to be something which is attractive. It's got to be demolished. And that's where, again, the deindustrialisation came. Whole sections were disappeared. And again, this is not Victorian times, it's during the 1950s. It's not just the valley, it's the quayside. And the quayside stretched right the way down through St. Leonard's and into St. Peter's. It had been neglected for a long time. You've got that's the cooperative building. You also have a quayside which has got no railings on it, which meant that on frequent occasions cars disappeared into the water. It's not a safe area, and the buildings are obviously run down and not very nice, and they're old, and they give the impression of being old-fashioned and out of date. Again, lots of old buildings. Broad chair before development. The court warehouse, which we've just seen. The quayside where you would get boats. This is an area where you had boats going to Europe and you could get passage on them. Obviously you had boats which took materials over there, products over there, but it was falling apart basically, and it wasn't very attractive. Again, you can tell how old that photograph is. Are those buildings, you have to ask yourself, are they fit for purpose? And that's where the law courts were redeveloped. Are they fit for purpose? And the answer is no, they're not. One of the wards that we can see near to St. Peter's was Byker, and Byker consisted mainly of a lot of terraced houses built for people who worked down near the river. But by the 1960s, and again, this is to do with deindustrialisation and lack of investment, there was very poor housing stock, very little open space. So new homes had to be created in the Byker wall, again, which required investment. One of the problems which you had when an industry falls apart and the factories close is that if it's boatyards, if it's coal mines, they were relying very heavily on labour. And the closures would affect families. Because remember, if you had no job, you couldn't pay the rent. There's a sort of parallel here, isn't there, with today? You couldn't feed your children properly or pay energy, well, definitely pay energy bills. And often, if your address was in this area, credit may not be very easy to find. And it did get unpleasant because people were very, very unhappy and they were struggling. And you did get some riots and you did get high unemployment rates. And people could only rent rather than pay for their own housing. But where could you find information of this? This is the ripple or the domino effect. What happens with one thing ripples out into the rest of society and environment. If you imagine what it was like, there are lots of very good black and whites that you can look at about the dirty, polluting, deindustrialised landscapes where people lived. Sites were crammed with buildings which didn't produce anything, and they started to be a danger to life, and children would play there with old-fashioned processes and no money to refit. Imagine what Hawthorn Leslie must have been like with enormous machines inside the factories. They'd have to be bolted down, and that means it's not an easy move. You couldn't just pick the machines up and take them somewhere, and you had to refit them and you had to change them, and the expense would be crippling. The same building ultimately could be converted into something else, or it could change what it was making, but it was difficult. And the loss of traditional markets abroad also meant that you weren't having any money coming into this area. Changes in transport, the emergence of super tankers in other parts of the world, where you had custom built docks to build enormous vessels, which we could only dream of because we have a very narrow river. And it could be very difficult to produce and to actually manage to build something really big. So we had to adapt. There is an outline diagram called Task 1 in the task folder, which shows impact on the area following deindustrialisation. You can classify as social, economic, and environmental. And your social is mainly on people's manners and attitudes. It can become very frustrating and your expectations start to decrease. You have economic problems because no industry, no rent being paid means less money going to local councils. And environmental, obviously, means that you're going to have dereliction, residential properties being abandoned, and an increase of danger, burglary, fly tipping, etc. So it's all a mixture, if you like, of things going wrong. But how can you find out how this area called Byker compares to the rest of England and Wales? Well, one of the really good ones, because you've got no census data, it could be the statistics, the NOMIS where you can find out about a profile for our ward and biker, and there it is. And it will give you information about what it's like in 2011 for biker. And it will give you different kinds of sections of employment, for example, comparing to Newcastle, comparing to England and Wales. And you could get that from wherever you are. You just go to the website, choose which area you want to look at, and it will give you an idea for 2011, how many people are working in comparison with, say, Newcastle upon Tyne or England and Wales. And economically inactive. Are you retired? Are you student? Are you long-term sick? Are you other? And economically active, you can only be economically active if there are areas where you can get a job. And you can only get a job if you are fully qualified, if you've got qualifications. But apprenticeships figure there. But there are also people who don't have any qualifications at all. It's about expectation, and it's about input into these areas to help people get jobs and get qualifications. So there's some nice statistics on that website. Could you make a chart? Yes, I'm sure you could. 2011, you could make a nice chart where you can compare, and you've got your secondary data there. Tells you a little bit about what people's lives are like. But sometimes the buildings were closed down and they lay empty. If you go to Lancashire, for example, or Yorkshire, there are huge mills there where you didn't make materials anymore. You didn't weave and you didn't spin, but they were left empty, and then they became then they became derelict because their products were no longer needed. And sometimes they were too old-fashioned. I mean, I'm thinking particularly about Hawthorn Leslie, poor access, old-fashioned energy, and obviously no room to actually expand. But what happened to all the buildings if they were deemed unfit for use? This is a divergence, and the best example I could think of to explain the idea of a building which isn't fit for purpose was in fact the refuge assurance in Manchester. A lovely Victoria, I've been in it, it's a lovely Victorian building, magnificent with the fittings inside, but it became too old-fashioned for refuge assurance to continue to use. It was a big area of administration, and there were typists, there were people who used all sorts of different means where they were filing, and it was very much labor intensive. But ultimately, refuge assurance decided that it was just too expensive, and we weren't able to use it as it should be used, and they moved out. In Newcastle, Hawthorn Leslie also had to try and restructure for modern engines, larger ships, and it just started to becoming too expensive. Workforces would have to be retrained. New yards in the Far East were competing very heavily. And so you would find that factories were closed down in St. Peter's and St. Lawrence next to the river. And here's the Refuge Assurance Building. Magnificent Victorian building, clean red brick, but not fit for the original purpose it was built for. Refuge Assurance worked with all the money that people made. Lancashire was very, 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 very profitable for the big mills and for the coal mines and for the shipbuilding. And these people needed somewhere to actually invest their money, and the Refuge Assurance Company offered that to them. Imagine that you had to, this was where the secretaries would work, 1912, 1,700 typists, enormous high ceilings, just waiting to be converted into wire areas for computers. It wasn't going to work. So you had a beautiful building with tiles, with areas where you would have had office workers. And the inside was designed specifically to give grandeur, opulent, and it was almost a listed building. It was very, very important for the designs they used there. And of course, I think they brought that, the ceiling window, they brought it from a railway station in Scotland. And you would see that there was a horse there, which gives a nod to the way in which the wealthy would get to the refuge assurance building underneath a portico, and they would get out of the carriage and the horses would be there as well. But the buildings and the tiles were opulent. And do you really want to knock something like that down? And there's your horse. There are the custom built tiles, handmade in many cases. And the ballroom, which used to be the dining room. Refuge assurers looked after its staff very well, and they would be able to go here and have their lunch. The men would have to sit on one side, obviously, and the women would sit on the other. And that black area there was, in fact, an orchestra pit. There would be an orchestra playing whilst you were having your lunch, or there would be a comedian, or there would be some kind of play going on. So they were quite advanced in looking after their staff, but obviously it's huge. And it wasn't going to remain like that for very long. So what do you do with it? Do you demolish it in the middle of Manchester? Do you convert it possibly into a hotel? Do you convert it into an area where you have a hotel and you have leisure facilities and maybe do weddings? It's had a number of different owners, but the owners have managed to maintain the building itself and the tiles. So it's actually almost a listed building. And it's very, very popular. It's lovely to go into. The wood is fantastic. Hawthorn Leslie, however, is a slightly different kettle of fish. One way that you can look at an area is from the air, and there are a number of small photographs here from historic England about our area in the north bank of the Tyne. You can see where the Spillers Flower Works is. You can see where housing are in long terraces. People probably wouldn't have gardens. You can see the railway line on our side, on the north bank, and you can see the area where our factory, our named example, is. You can also see on Gateshead's side, there's large areas which haven't been developed, which is slightly strange. But you also see from different angles. So you could get, if you wanted to see what the area was like before it changed. And the overheads are, the aerial ones are quite nice, from that one to the next one. And you can actually pick out where individual buildings are. So it's obviously showing that you've got large areas neatly built for housing, for the workforce, and you can see the actual outline of the roads. So it's easy to actually pinpoint certain areas. Again, an aerial photograph. But what's going to happen to it? You see, end of the war, the whole country had a problem because there was no money, literally. And it took quite a while for councils and the government to build up enough money to be able to do something to improve the quality of life and environment for people. And one of the things which came forward was the Tyne and Wear Development Corporation, where the government wanted to identify areas, possibly of coalfields, which could use help and investment. And they set up a scheme whereby individual areas would actually bid for money if they could put forward a good scheme, and the government allocated one of these areas for Tyne and Wear. It was designed to build, and it was designed to attract, and it was designed to create businesses, to improve the quality of life for people, and to give them opportunities to work, and to improve the environment and landscape. Plans were submitted and the quayside was chosen along with the weir. The quayside and the area beyond the Ousebourne was derelict and deteriorating, and unfortunately Hawthorn Leslie lay in this area. The actual construction couldn't take place until demolition had occurred. And if you compare this to the aerial views which we saw before, the buildings have been wiped away. They've just gone. And you've got all of this area for development. You've got clear roads and you've got green areas and you've got the opportunity to build anew. And there's the Ousebourne, the mouth of the Ousebourne, with housing already existing near to Spiller's Quay. And the area in Gateshead, that's being improved as well. These images are taken from Google Maps. Brilliant resource. And they will give you notations along to show you what actually is there, whether it's, you know, the Ousebourne or the River Tyne. And this can give you a much brighter look at what the area was going to be once it was renovated. Housing was important, and in the bottom left-hand corner, you've got housing which was built from scratch, and you've also got areas which are cleared, which was the Spiller's Wharf and the Malmo Quay area, where there's a good chance that you're going to have flats being built there as well. The roads are clear and it's looking much better. It's bright and it's attractive, and there are green spaces. And there we have our area, which is St. Peter's Basin. It's a residential development and it's very nicely laid out. It's got an area of green to the north. It's got the old railway line, which is an area where you've got nice walks, access, cycle tracks, and you've got areas where you've got small holdings, along with, to the left, an area where you've got industry and you have employment. A much better look than when it was an area where you had our named example of Hawthorn Leslie. Again, you can see the buildings. It's always interesting to look at the street names in a place like this, because Rose Court, well, we had an area where you had a factory owned by Rowe, R-O-W-E, and you also had Merchants Quay, and you have names there which will actually give you an idea about what it was like. The Ropery is another one where you would have had a rope works. Areas there, you've got your allotments, which is the steep bank, and you couldn't build there. It would be too difficult. There's the army reserves, and there are nice housing areas there. There's Bell Valves and the Tip, but also, you know, this is an area where you've got opportunity to build nice, big, modern buildings. The Fusiliers are there as well, and it's got good access. It's got clear roads, and it's got an open area, an open field to the area. There are very few houses down there which are empty. Spiller's Wharf should have been developed. It was going to be developed as a big entertainments area, a leisure area, but because COVID came along, it didn't happen. But it's there waiting to be developed if anyone wants to take it on. That's the end of the maps and the aerial photographs and using Google and where you can get stats from. Suggested tasks, how you can use the data. You can do a flow chart by filling it in. We saw that before. And there's an outline there that you can fill in yourself. Always better to do it yourself for deindustrialisation. You can look at the stats from NOMIS, do an area where you've got a chart, for example, draw conclusions from that, the knock-on effects of the crime rates in the 1970s, from the closure of boatyards and coal mines, the riots, social unrest, unemployment rates. Think about the impacts on a riverside community, and that the impacts there are quite serious. And this is what the Tyne Development Corporation was trying to address, where it said more jobs for the north, caring for the quayside. And they printed out a whole range of different fact sheets which you can use to help you understand what the thinking was behind the development along the river. You could look for crime figures if you wanted to. You could look for antisocial behaviour. You can look for biker. You can look for all sorts of different things there. And the task would be, Hawthorn Leslie, look at the adverts for what it made. And they were big, and they were clunky, and they were all based on railways, those two especially. Engines, shipping, railway engines. Have you any ideas what you may have to show why the original site was ideal for the company, and put them on an actual photograph? Annotation is good because it interprets what you've done and understand from that particular site. Clear arrows, clear signing. Where did you get the photograph from? And you can put what you've learnt on there as well. Could you do the same for the Hawthorn Leslie shipping? And could you also put on there why it looks like it's going to fail, because there's absolutely no room for expansion or change. One of the nice ideas that you could do is take a photograph and then Photoshop it, give an outline, because then you can annotate, you can colour it in, you can section it, and it will give a clear indicator of your understanding of that area. Your maps can show different areas. For example, this is where Hawthorn Leslie started off, near Forth Banks in the centre of town. And you can get brilliant maps from the National Library of Scotland and the Ordnance Survey to identify where our area is. The other thing that you can do is you can get overlays, assuming you can remember. You must remember to get the right map, because you can do, there are slides you can put along where you can get a transparency over the actual map itself, and you can see how it's changed. And it's interesting to see that the roads are still in situ, they're still there, very similar to what it was when it began with its industrialisation. And that's the last one. And it shows where we've got an area where we have St. Peter's Basin, an area where you have industrial development, and to the north you have new building for new houses, employment, ease of access, with a really good local transport system. So I'm hoping that this has given you some ideas about looking at an area, looking at a named example, and being able to use what you've gleaned from your research, and it'll help you to understand if you do a question or if you have this kind of thing in your personal inquiry. And I'll pass you over to Brenda.
Thank you so much, Liz. It's absolutely fascinating. I really enjoyed that one, looking at all the old maps and adverts and so on and things like that. I think some of the material came from the Northeast Regeneration Archive,
Yes.
NERA.
Yes.
So that's a useful link for people to know about. That's a wealth of information. But before we run out of time, thank you very, very much on behalf of the Tyne and Wear branch of the Geographical Association. The marvellous information, and what to do with it as well. So that's great. Thank you ever so much.
You're welcome.